Hello, hello, everyone. Today is June 24th. This is the bi-weekly, it is bi-weekly, right? Yeah, bi-weekly sub-project meeting for enhancements. This is the enhancements sub-project is a sub-project of SIG architecture. This is a meeting that will be recorded and available on the internet later. So please be mindful of what you say and do. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes code of conduct. And in general, just be awesome people. So we've got a pretty short agenda today. Kirsten, do you want to take it away with your?
Sure. I guess I'll share my screen, or I can share the link. It's up to whatever people want. Like sometimes I feel lame sharing a screen when it's like a pull request or something, but I'll just share my screen.
Sure way. Yeah, let me make sure you have access. Hold on. Okay, go for it.
So I'll put the link here, but I'll share my screen as well, and I will find the correct screen to share. This one. Okay, cool. We're only looking at what we should be looking at. So yeah, basically I was going through a lot of the enhancements. Like I was trying to go through a lot of like the enhancements to do and a lot of the sort of ideas that we had. And the one thing that struck me, and I came up with it in the last meeting, was that a lot of them seem to depend on like having an existing infrastructure for kind of iterating on KEPs. So there's a couple of things that I've noticed across time is that we make sort of incremental changes to the KEP template, which is okay. Like when we were trying to get the KEP template to a point where it made sense, but I feel like we're now sort of mature enough to say, okay, we're not going to just like merge incremental changes into a template that is active that everybody's using. And it's for a couple of reasons. First, we have some tooling that's being worked on. We have a website that's being worked on. We want to increase sort of communication about the template and say like, hey, like this is eventually like we want to version the template and say, this is, the version that we expect you to be on and have some policy for that. And also we don't have like a great way to like diff templates or even start versioning them because we don't ever have like the template. We just have a document in the directory. And so I thought that a good way to start, because this seems also like a prerequisite for a lot of other things. Like we want feedback and we want to iterate. Well, how do you iterate on something? Or how do you start creating these draft things and start, thinking about new ideas if you can't like have a stable way to say, okay, well, this is the working one. This is the active template. And then this is the one that we're working on. So to me, like this kind of seems like a key thing to do as a basis for a lot of the improvements that we want to make. And that's kind of why I started to just focus on this idea of having the active template, but then having a staging directory and having all of the changes that people want to go into the template go into the staging directory that is potentially periodically reviewed and then, batched out in some way, whether it's an official version or it's an unofficial version or whatever, just to bring some stability to the existing template. Because I do think that I think that the incremental changes are actually harder to catch from, there's no version. So, but I think that the incremental changes are hard to identify, and it's hard to say, hey, like people really need to have this update or that update. And I also want to start thinking about versioning the KEPs, but also like coming up with a versioning policy and other things. So like, this is just like a bare bones idea that I just threw up a PR just to like kick off some kind of discussion because it's going to probably require some other things. But all I did was, since this is what I talked about, and I know I talked about it with Bob as well, like was just creating a staging directory, which is basically, I just made like, I'm not wedded to any of these directories or names or anything. But basically, this is the candidate KEP template, which would be a subdirectory, which would be where all of the changes would go into, like all of the new changes would be merged into, or potential changes. The README just says like merge into staging, not directly into the active template. And then eventually, like we formally archive, I created an archive as well, but I don't know where that went. And then we would formally like move the current template to the archives directory, wherever that went. I can't find it anymore.
You probably need like a git keep file or something because if the
no, here it is.
Oh, okay, right.
I added I'm dumb. I added a README just to make sure that the directory was there. So it's basically the idea of put your changes into staging. You can see all of the changes together and see like, hey, like, do we have enough changes to actually change the official template yet? Maybe not, right? Like maybe it's like we have a bunch of trivial changes that aren't really worth it. Maybe we have a pressing change. I don't know. And then formally sort of move the active template into the archives, because that's going to also let us do diffs, because the one thing that I noticed too is that we don't have a good way to say, hey, you need to make these changes, like, because we don't have versioning, but these are the new changes that we made. It's just like looking at the template with your eyeballs, which really sucks. So I think that like potentially moving to this workflow is going to be a bit better for us. But obviously you can't just create staging directories without doing other work, because it brings up a bunch of other questions. So I kind of have like this work in progress issue. This is all like work in progress. I'm just like kind of brain dumping. So it'd be like create the staging directory, create some guidelines for that, right? Because there could potentially be changes that need to go in faster. It's not just like I would love for this to be more clear. This might be like, I would be thinking of tooling, right? Like, hey, like this is actually broken. This has broken our tooling. This is very urgent. So I'd like to kind of think about enumerating those changes where maybe either you would still merge into staging, but that might quickly go into the template with some sort of announcement. Like, and that's why I have number 3, which is create communication guidelines about this. So the one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes the kept template changes, but we're not telling anybody that it's changing. We're not like highlighting that. And we're also not, like I said, create a deprecation policy. We're not telling people, hey, like this change is big enough that we think that everyone should update their kept to have it. We did that for PRR. We definitely transitioned that. But there are other changes that kind of go into the kept. And I do think that we need to come up with an idea of like, when do people need to update to the new template? When do people need, just in general, like forget about like whether the template's versioned or not, but like how often does a person really need to update the kept template, and how often is that fair? Because the one thing that I would worry about for versioning is that, people are constantly telling people to update their like, let's say you have an active kept, alpha, beta, GA. How many times should you really have to update the template of the kept for that, right? So I would say, think that through and say like, we should really think about minimizing the urgent changes to the kept template where we're forcing people to upgrade. It might be like a year. Like if your kept can get through the whole thing without any like major changes that everybody needs to change, like you don't have to upgrade your template or something. So this is just like a total brain dump. I drink a lot of coffee, something I'm working on. I'm trying to think through sort of what this would need to work, but also trying to make it lightweight enough that it doesn't become like too bogged down in everything else. And then hopefully this will help all of the other iterations that we want to do on the cast. Hopefully it will make sure that we don't break anything for tooling, because that's something that I also want to think about, is like keeping the template stable and having people working on tooling being able to look at the staging template and everything else and test it and say, hey, this actually like doesn't work.
I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna jump in since you're
on. Sorry, I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay. So we are. I think we're barking up the same tree with maybe different approaches. So I think this comes back to the to kept-ctl, right? So kept-ctl, I would. I think I don't know if I've said it on a recorded call before, but originally kept-ctl looked like it was written in 5 different ways by at least 5 different people, and it was is the answer. So I think over the last cycle and change, we have tried to kind of like marry all of those different streams and write each of the separate commands in a similar way. Where that is leading, or where that hopefully leads, is running your kept through a command is supposedly supposed to be your source of truth, right? If the template tells you, or rather not so much the template, but the metadata itself, if our command, if v1 of, or v1 010 of kept-ctl says that it runs, that it accepts v, v0 through v2 of the kept metadata, right? And there are conversion mechanisms between each of those points, right? If between, for kept metadata v010, right, and 050, we decided that PRRs are required. Maybe that's not actually 010 to 050. Maybe that's 010 to 1, to version 1, right? Because we've made we've made a, like, is it a backward compatible change if we had them in both versions of the metadata? Depends, right? But the tooling should be able to support that, right? I should be able to use kepctl to say, like, kepctl promote whatever, or kepctl reconcile fields, right? And it should spit out, hey, you're missing scope, you're missing this stage is blah for, right, or we don't use that format anymore, right? And it should give you a list of, like, here's how to fix your thing, or automate it, right?
Right, but kepctl itself isn't, I think that's like the tooling, but that's not, like, people still have to make the decision.
No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing. Like,
and so I think that
allow me the coffee ranch for a little bit as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that is one aspect of it. The tooling should prevent you from doing the wrong thing, right? Whether it's the combination of the tooling as well as the pre-submits, like our pre-submits today will make sure that, one, like, kepctl can actually be built, and two, that the keps that are written down today have, like, appropriate tables of contents, so on and so forth, right? And some of the metadata checking. The templates are part of that, right? But I think that ultimately it comes down to the content. The reason I mentioned the versions is because if we look at this like semantically, right? If we look at this from the perspective of Semver, and we talk about versioning, these templates are versioning the metadata in the same way, then when, one, we're looking at multiple release boundaries, right? If I say that we're going to make a breaking change, or we say that we're going to make a breaking change to the kept template between releases 122 and 123, right? We announce prior to that boundary, and we give people the tool that they need to get onto the right version of the template, right? Say it's a smaller change, right? Say it's a wording change that's just really is a quality of life improvement, right? Maybe that is a patch version of a template change, right? Or a patch version of a metadata change, right? Maybe we say that, like, oh, well, there's no reason that we need the V's in the versioning in the versions for the kept metadata. Maybe we're going to strike the V's, or we say that the V's are optional, or something like that, right? That could be an example of something that's a patch update for the kept metadata, or for what's in the kept templates, right? Ultimately, the reason I'm pointing at the metadata as opposed to the template, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that I think that, there should be some system for the templates as well, but the metadata is something that we can programmatically validate against, right? And releasing both the tool, the metadata spec, as well as updates to the template along the same versioning boundaries, give us an opportunity to do, like, a release announcement, right? Like, hey, we changed this, and scope is now required, PRRs are now required, this, the kept template has been updated in these ways to assist you with that, and the tool will now block changes unless if you do kepctl convert to blah, you'll get the right, or kepctl fix, or whatever we want to call it, right? You'll get the right stuff out. I think, some of the template updates make sense, like you said, to do immediately, because they are quality of life improvements, right? Maybe it's something like, it points to the glossary now, and we've just updated a glossary and it points to the glossary now, or the template is in a totally different location now. But I see this as like a same way we might do Go modules in a repo, right? Maybe templates v1, v2, blah blah blah. So that there's no need to necessarily like archive something, but you get both the same template as well as the same metadata within that module. So I will stop my coffee talk for a second.
Yeah, I think that these two ideas are supportive of each other. I would say that the validation tool is awesome, right? But the problem is that nobody wants to be using the wrong template and then find out. I mean, it's going to happen, right? You find out via their tool.
It's going to happen.
But for those people who might be being proactive or might need references, right? Like, because tool telling you one thing is one thing, but you still need to go somewhere and be like, okay, I got to change something. How do I have to change it? So you do need that sort of very visual representation. But I also think that it's about, like you were saying, communication and being able to say, hey, like, this is the whatever template that we're using. These are the changes from the old template. This is what you should know. I think that having that visible to the user, because tools, regardless, it's like you have to use the tool to find out. You have to have the KEP written to find out. And so if you're a SIG lead, that's not necessarily going to be as helpful because you're like, well, I'm not really like running this through a tool. I just want to see the new changes. Or maybe we want to communicate the changes in a way that we can say, hey, like, this is a diff. These are the new changes. Like, be aware. You need to be aware that you might need this new information. This is what the template looks like. So I think that they're like supportive ideas, but also like the KEP CTL isn't like, it's not AI, right? It's not making the decisions. People have to make the decisions. And so I think like having, even though it's like super lo-fi, having this way of doing it is what helps facilitate people making the decisions, which then KEP CTL picks up on, because like it's going to be enhancements that says, hey, I think that this is an important change now. I think we have enough for this to be a real version that we need to block on, so that KEP CTL is going to block on it. Yeah. And I think that they're like, one is like people tooling that fuels like the automated tooling. Because I know like I wouldn't be able to really say, hey, yeah, like I think that these are enough changes without really looking at the changes and being like, I don't think that should be blocking on this. And I think that also lets the decision-making framework be a little more explicit as well. So it's not just like this sort of magic hands, like tooling is telling me one thing. It's like, well, why is the tooling telling you that? And it's like, well, we actually made these changes and these are why they're important and whatever. You can have like a little change log and a little blurb. So I think that they're like complementary ideas, but I'm also just a little bit concerned about as tooling is developing, not changing the template willy-nilly like that. I mean, for me, it's like, I don't want this template to change willy-nilly anymore. Like I want it to be very like, just as a general thing considered, because I think that we potentially can really break a lot of things and also just like undermine credibility with the greater community if we, at this point where the template is, just make changes all the time to it.
So to be clear, the any changes to KEP CTL or pre-submits, what have you, would be in support of policy changes, not the other way around, right? So with the template changes, to your point, I also worry about moving things around because there are docs from time immemorial and different, different things that have been published about us and, that link to very specific places. So ideally we can like not change those links and not break those links. But I also worry about like, what are we putting into the template that, what's the right way to phrase, sorry, James, you have your hand up, go.
Stephen, when you say KEP metadata, you're referring to the data in the KEP.yaml file.
Right.
That's what you mean. Okay.
Yeah.
And kind of my other question was, if we're talking about the versioning, and by the way, I'm a big plus one on the versioning. This is this whole thing, Kristen, is something I didn't think we needed. I didn't even consider that we might want until you said we should do this. I'm like, of course, why aren't we doing this?
We weren't ready. We weren't ready. So if you look at the repo, you'll notice that there are 2 milestones. One is KEP's beta, and the other one's KEP's GA. the goal was always versioning.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that's exactly why those milestones exist. Because like there
But
was
just
an
to
idea, but yeah.
But just to clarify though, I'm also talking, I'm not thinking, I mean, I'm thinking of the cat.yaml file, but I'm actually really thinking about also the README file, because I know that file can really be improved. And sometimes there are incremental changes that go in. And that's sort of the file that people interact with a lot, and that's what people are reviewing. And I'm thinking about bringing stability, especially to that readme.md that has like all of the meat of the cabinet.
So
sorry, my quick follow-on question would be, especially for you, Chris, with this proposal, why don't we jump straight to a basic rudimentary versioning? Why don't we just say what we have right now in the repo is the version, I don't know, 0.10 or whatever, version 1 doesn't matter, and just say we're going to determine our versioning scheme from here, but this is version number X.
Well, yeah, that was kind of like implicit, but
implicit,
I didn't want to have to like sort of I'm like I didn't want to get into like what do we call the versions or anything like that. I was kind of like, okay, like first get the directory set up and then just have people merging into staging instead of into an active template, because that is nails on a chalkboard for me. Then, let's think about, because you can't really say this version is version X until you stop changing the version.
Changing it, yeah.
Right. So that's what, like, I guess I was thinking of it really incrementally, where I'm like, let's just stop changing the active template first. Like, let's get into the practice of not changing an active template without more consideration and communication and having a staging directory. And once we can actually like say we're not merging directly into that, then we could say, okay, that's actually version 0. You can call it version whatever you want. And then now we're staging. And now when we decide to release, then it's like, okay, cool. Like this is now version whatever 1. It's the date. I don't know. There's going to be a lot of feelings about what a version's called, but yeah, like I really thought about that as well, James. But it was really like you got to have it set up so that you don't merge into the active one before that can become a version.
Oh, we're gonna ride those minor versions for a while. So we don't have to go.
Sorry, one more quick question. It feels almost to me like with the kind of archive directory and like the staging directory, like we're effectively re-implementing a Git workflow with like milestones
slightly.
and releases.
Okay. So slightly, but this is the thing that I thought about a lot. And one of the things that I think is confusing is like Git is great, right? Because you have a bunch of commits and you can see the history. But when you want a version, you don't necessarily care about all of the individual commits. You care about like, what is the biggest change? What are all of the changes from here to here? And memorializing that. And like, I mean, the fact is like, no user wants to look at a Git history. They want to just see maybe a diff. They want to see the new version, and they might want to see the old version. And I think that it's about like a better sort of UX, UI for that, as opposed to like relying on Git. Because Git is great for code, but it is freaking terrible. Well, even for releases, Git kind of sucks. Like GitHub kind of sucks. Like if we're honest,
it all sucks. So
but it's about potentially batching it out too and squashing all of those commits and saying these are the changes into the template. Like this is now like Git commit template this, like and because I do not know if having individual commits on the template is as much clarity as people also need when you could just have like one commit per version and then diff them.
Yeah.
Because it's really, for me, the change log and change log and a diff, where you're just, because I've just noticed that after dealing with this for so long, where it's like, it's really hard to tell people what they need to update. And not in the YAML, but in the README. That's extremely hard. And being able to say, these are the changes. You have to make them or you don't have to make them. They're optional, whatever it is. These are them. And letting the person be able to just see that and be like, okay, I have to add this section. I have to do this is going to make it a lot easier for users.
So for me, I think, at least as like a custodian of the process and tooling and yada, 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 what I've found over time is that the I think we've laid down enough of the process. Like before, like the reason that milestone was like KEP's beta is I was like, I don't even know what beta looks like. I don't even know what, like, I was like, we're definitely in alpha right now. We shipped this thing like 2+ years ago. And like, I know what that is. I know what we initially started off with. I don't know what beta looks like. Everything else goes into beta. I think now that we have the reason I keep coming back to the metadata is because it gives us an opportunity to enforce rules. If those rules, ideally those rules map to things that are written in the KEP template as well, right? And that makes it easier to tie together. I think one of the harder parts about this is like, would we be saying that we are versioning the metadata alongside the template?
I mean, I would say that the easiest way, if I had a magic wand, I don't know anything, I don't know how the tools work, I would say the version is held in the YAML. And so it's like, and maybe there's a field in the README just to verify that the person didn't just update the YAML or something, like, I don't know. But I think that the version means that you have to check both the YAML and the readme.md. But the readme.md is really the tricky one where like, I'm not as concerned about like, is your YAML correct or not? Because that's like, okay, fine, tooling can handle that. I'm really concerned about the readme.md and getting that one updated. So wherever the version goes, whether it goes in both files, whether it goes in one file, I probably should be in both files, fields. I don't know, but yeah.
Okay. That is all right. Yeah, because so we're on the same page then. Because
yeah, to me they're a unit. They go together. Like the YAML and the readme.md, they're like they're a unit. They match.
Yeah, because if I tell you that PRRs are required, right? That's a line in that we may add to as a comment to to the README. But it's the reason I keep coming back to the metadata is because like that's something that we can enforce in the tool and we can block PRs, right? So like for me, the enforcement, the policy change is definitely a component of of the communication, but going from warnings, which you will never see, like if no one's looking at like the test infra is a fun example where there are I think there are warnings for various types of tests and whether or not you have like test grid alerts configured or they're on the right dashboards, depending on what folders they're in or they're going to the right clusters. That's a good example of like, we're getting warnings, but the warnings are not visible until a failure happens, right? So the reason I bring it up is for like SIG release, when we build a new branch and we have to do the new branch jobs, often we will get multiple failures during the branch job creation because they're like, oh, well, where did these warnings come from? They're actually warnings that were always cropping up in the tests, but they only presented themselves because there was also a failure attached to them, right? So there is for me, I see that there is a warning mode for KEP-CTL or whatever validations that we run that like would pop up in pre-submits, but also would be something that you could just run and say like, oh, well, I'm, SIG release and API machinery, like KEP blah, 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 blah. And it goes like, ooh, by the way, like, going into this new version, you're going to need to do blah, right? And it won't block you from doing anything, but it'll make sure that those changes are coming, right? And there are accompanying changes in the README that you need to be aware of, but right now you need to change the scope field to this, right? It needs to be one of these values. And then, the next phase of that is enforcement, where like, okay, well, we told you this was coming, we put it in the README, we announced it on the release notes. Now it's a blocking change, right? So any KEPs that do not have this thing will not merge. So yeah, the reason I keep coming back to the tooling is because like it's so clear that we need enforcement at this stage, given the amount of folks that are working on this are not able to work on this.
I mean, this enforcement is happening anyway when the release team reads these things. It's just manual and late.
which is the problem.
Well, even for the release team though, the one thing that strikes me when I did the release team or when I look at keps is that it's like, I know that this kep is not the right version. Like I know it's missing some changes. I know that it has like some old fields, but I don't have a good way to easily tell the author, like, because right now it's just based on like, how familiar are you personally
It's
with the
finger in
template,
the wind.
which is
It's finger in the
right.
wind. How much history
And
do you
for the
have?
readme especially, like how familiar are you with it that you can look at it and say, I think that you're missing something. And I think that this just gives a much easier way to say, this looks like it's old. Can you just double check that you're at the correct version? This is the diff. Make sure all those sections are there. Like, I just think that like it's like I think you're talking about a lot of like quantitative tools, but there's always going to be a sort of qualitative aspect to the keps because there's a lot of text, there's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
And I think also improving that part and making that a little bit more straightforward, because authors want to have a correct kep. They want to have all of the information there and to be able to say like, number one, we're not changing it out from under you all the time. We're not going to keep coming up to you and saying like, you're missing a field, you're missing this, you're missing that in the readme, because that's like unfair, right?
It's a waste of time for a lot of people too, right?
Exactly, right? And
there's
saying like,
churn in the communication, yeah.
Exactly, and saying like, hey, like the changes, especially to the README, are not trivial. Changes to kep.yaml, I mean, they're not trivial, but they're really straightforward. To README, it's not straightforward. And so I think we have to be really careful about how we batch out changes to that readme.md file. So I guess that's what I'm thinking more of instead of the kep.yaml. I mean, is that readme.md and being able to articulate those changes clearly, being able to articulate when we want that updated, because that is a lot more work. That's a lot more effort and review cycles. And we need to be able to be clear about that.
So I think that part of this is like, again, I keep saying like the reason I keep bringing up the metadata, right? So like a large change, ideally a large change to the template can be bound to a change in the metadata, right? Like PRR enforcement, scope changes, yada, yada, yada. Those are things that are kind of easy to be like, oh, you got to go click that button or change that word in the metadata for it to pass now, right? Smaller changes, like if it's like, is it, so I think what would be helpful, like in the scope of, for like semantically, right, to talk about what a major, minor, and patch change looks like to this template, right? Like for me, maybe a patch change is, a patch change is some non-blocking, like maybe it's some language fix, or maybe like a link broke and we're fixing that, and it's kind of one of those things like, just put it in, because like it's quality of life improvement, and it's not really like we're changing the template out from under you. It's like literally like, this link broke, it's a 404, like go fix that, right? Then we've kind of got these like, these minor changes that are like, okay, well they're still compatible with what you had, right? So and maybe there is a thing that's coming that would be nice if you had it included in the template, but the release team the release team might not block on this kind of thing, right? And maybe it's something that does fit in the scope of fits in the scope of like a metadata change and a version bump for the kep metadata, and maybe it doesn't, right? But then there's the this is going to like completely upend your process. Like you need to pay very close attention to this, and you may need to rewrite portions of this kep to get it done. And the portions are like so much different. Like that's the major change to me. And like, so if we can quantify, like get to an agreement of what those changes look like, then I think it's going to help us lay out the directory, and it's going to help us lay out binding the template changes to the metadata changes.
Can we use old changes as examples? Can we go back and look at previous changes we've had to the kep template and say, this is an example of a major, example of a minor, this is an example of a patch?
Yeah. I mean, even I think we can look at a current example, or a currently being discussed example, right? Adding a version to the metadata, right? This would be a change, but it's a change that we can tell kepctl, it's like, hey, it's cool, they didn't have versions before. If they didn't have versions before, assume it's pre-version 1010 or something, right? And that's something that we can let fly because we don't expect you to, like, that's a, like, if we make a change like that, we're saying like, we don't expect you to go sweep all of your keps and make sure versions are added. It's a little, it feels a little silly, right? But moving forward, once we do set this, like if we are going to decide on a version and we make changes that are outside of the scope of that version, then being able to say, okay, well, now we're doing a version bump. But we also need to ensure that the keps that came in with this version number or pre this version number at least have a minimum version, right? So that may be a tooling change. We're like, oh, now this does, like we set 010 and now this doesn't have a version. So like that should be blocking. That should be blocking pre-submits. And someone from enhancements should be setting the versions across all the keps kind of thing, right? To make sure people are in compliance.
Well, that's on the issue. I already had like that was this general thing was something that I was working on because I know that like you just can't, the directories can't stand alone. So I will take a stab. It's like just kind of getting it all out there. It's like that I feel like it's easier to talk about than actually to do. So that's why I was like, let me make the directories first. People can stare at it. Let me then like think about, because I already have like something in progress for the sort of process, but yeah, like major minor patch or something.
So yeah, so also with the I think yeah, think about the directory names a little bit. Even think about the names of, there are parts of me that like want to move a bunch of things around in the repo, like keps. So, okay, we have production readiness reviews. Production readiness reviews are really bound to keps. Why are they in a separate directory? They're in a separate directory to provide, ownership to the PRR review team. But that directory should potentially be within the kep directory. It does make some of the search and filter stuff for the tool easier. If they're kind of scoped within the same directories. That's a silly thing, but you start to think about like, okay, well, we've got keps and then potentially staging and potentially archives, right? The staging and archives live within the kep directory, or they live slightly above it. I would almost say that like they live above it so that they don't impact tooling.
Yeah, that's fine.
And and then you think of like module-y things, right? So if we were to shape this like a Go repo, and we're not doing branches or something like that, like we could do branches, but maybe we shouldn't do branches. Maybe that's a crazy idea. If you shape it like, okay, I'm bumping from a sub, a sub or up to V1 module to V2, I'm either going to bump the Go mod and say it's V2 now, or I'm going to go in and add another subdirectory that says V2, V2, V3, etc. Right? And then all the content, the content would be a mirror or a mirror-ish plus whatever new content, right? So I guess I say that to say, instead of staging, or instead of like, one, there'll be a question of, do we need archives, or can we just say that like these are the versions, right? Explicitly say these are the versions, right? And if it's if it's V05 or something like that, cool. All the V05 content gets in there. When it's time to merge, we merge into head or main of keps, and then we include the, I don't know, we can decide that it's just strictly release content, or we can decide that like, oh, we're adding a changelog.md to the keps, keps/changelog.md, right? And that includes like all the content for V05. But V05 can work in the separate tree or subdirectory, like you're saying, staging. I was just saying that like, if we say that it is what it is, we know that it's version.next, then that makes it a little easier to reason about, as opposed to just like global staging. And then so then like the concept of archives goes away. functionally, right? Because
yeah, I mean, archives is like, for me, it's not like, these are just memes that I have.
yeah. I know we're just
about,
talking
it's about like,
right.
it's about having something that is clear and sort of like the truth. And so that people can clearly refer back to it if they have a question, clearly diff if they have a question, and know what was in the past and know what is in the present and know what is in the future. I don't care about the names of it, but the real crux of the whole thing is just like, do not merge into the active template. Like do not merge into the active template is for me like the most important like thing out of all of it.
So I think the criteria for do not merge into active template would and that's why I was suggesting doing the major minor patch stuff, right? Because like if a link's broken, like I would prefer to see that fixed ASAP in the template, as opposed to it being seeded in a staging directory and then getting copied in and adding to like it's something that like we should just go fix. So I think having a clear idea of like when we do which kinds of actions, like this is like, you know, if we're doing a major version, like this is the kind of action that will only happen when we're cutting a release and we've done this kind of communication to the community, this amount of time has passed and these changes have been made to the tooling to support it, right? Like that's the only time we'll do the major release and the breaking change, right? But for like, you know, for minors, we may do it if it's like, if it's critical and it is, you know, again, like it's a quality of life improvement, or it's something that like went funny in the tooling that we need to both mention in the metadata or fix in the metadata, as well as mention in the README to watch out for kind of things, right? Like when like knowing where those boundaries are, I think will be helpful in developing the process.
I also think it's pretty likely that we're going to end up well, I say supporting, but having multiple different versions of the kept template kind of live. Like I wouldn't be surprised if 0.7 was the latest, greatest version. We might start a release and say, okay, we're going to allow keps in this release must be at least 0.5, but they can be 0.5, 0.6, or 0.7.
Yeah, that's the idea is to like, at least for me, to prevent churn, but you can't prevent like too much churn for an author until you like get a hold on the flow going into the template.
So one potential problem, so it worries me in general to have too much content out there, in terms of like too much content that looks similar, because I worry about people, and that's part of the reason why I was like pull the staging directory up or make it very clear that it is not part of the main, right? Because I worry about someone like, oh, well, I followed the template for this thing, and we're like, well, it wasn't live yet.
Yeah. That's
right,
fair.
kind of thing.
I'll move it. I'm not wedded to the location. I mean, it should be in the directory. I mean, not necessarily the template. I just put it there just to have it there.
Like, or, you know, related to the versions, is this something that goes in, like, does it actually go in a branch? Should it actually go in a branch? So like you can view the branch and track changes and stuff like that, but it doesn't actually get merged in until we decide that we're cutting a new release, right? So, I mean, there are a bunch of different ways that we can slice it. And I know that wasn't your final presentation. What else? Worries about, so worries about having the content in multiple places, but also like finding the answer to, I don't think we solved the question of, do I need a PRR? Is the release team tracking this? Right. And we started like slicing it up into the different, like, well, is it release impacting, or, you know, is it this, is it that, like, what is it, an apple or an orange? And we kind of did that exercise for a little bit. We didn't finish it. And I think what's going to happen at the end of it, or what we decide is the end or the beginning of the end of it, is there will be multiple kept templates.
Well, that was a reason why I think that it's important to sort this flow out, because I don't think that we can create good templates if we don't have a process for actually managing templates. and changes. Like that to me is also what's in the back of my mind, where I'm like, cool, like then we're gonna have like a zillion templates that are, especially when they're new,
yeah, times as many releases.
And when they're new, they're gonna have a lot of changes coming in, right? Like
Yeah.
they're not going to be stable. And so that's why to me, this also feels like a very important thing to figure out, because then when we say, okay, we're thinking about doing this new template, we already have a way to do it. We have a way to manage those changes, and we have a way to get that out, communicate that out, version that, and have that going, because we cannot figure that out at the same time. And it's going to be a mess if we do. So it's like, get the flow right on what we have right now, because we have a lot of experience on this. And then this will be the flow that we use to be able to iterate on these new templates that we are going to make, because we can't do these new templates without having a way to do it, saying, hey, like this is now, because what I'm thinking is like, okay, we have staging, or we have the new version that we're working on. Since everything now goes into the active template, we don't have a great way to communicate. But for a new template, you're gonna want like, hey, this is what we're working on. We've iterated a bunch of times. We want feedback. You know, like let's get feedback on like let's pull that in. Okay, we actually think that we're at a good place. Let's release that now. Like we need like this process is like, how do we approach just managing these templates in a way that makes sense to everyone, that we can get feedback on, that we can iterate on, etc. So that was actually in the back of